Imagine a prestigious royal event in London where everything appears completely normal. The guests are moving from one display to another. Journalists are waiting for their photographs. Cameras are recording every important moment, and members of the royal family are carrying out their official duties as planned. But then, within a matter of seconds, the atmosphere reportedly changes. According to the account behind this story, a woman who was not expected to be part of the restricted guest area manages to enter the event and approaches Catherine, Princess of Wales. What happens next is described as an uncomfortable confrontation involving family relationships, money, estates, and long-standing tensions. The shocking part is not simply that someone challenged a senior member of the royal family in public. The bigger question is how that person managed to get so close in the first place. Catherine reportedly does not respond with anger or turn the situation into a public argument. Instead, she remains composed while the people around her begin to realize that something unusual is happening. Nearby, Princess Anne is also observing the situation. Rather than getting drawn into the argument itself, her attention appears to turn toward the security arrangements and the question of how the woman entered the restricted area. That small detail becomes extremely important later, because a normal disagreement and a carefully arranged public confrontation are two very different things. If someone brings a private family grievance into a public royal engagement, directly in front of cameras and journalists, people will naturally ask whether it was simply an emotional reaction or whether there was some preparation behind it. The event eventually continues, but the questions do not disappear when the guests leave. Instead, the focus reportedly shifts toward the guest list, the access records, and the people responsible for approving attendance. And suddenly, what looked like a brief, uncomfortable moment inside a public event begins to look like a much bigger institutional problem. Was the woman genuinely there by mistake? Did somebody help her gain access? Or was the confrontation planned because cameras were already present? Those questions become the foundation of everything that follows. After the event, the situation reportedly becomes much more serious. Security arrangements are reviewed, guest records are examined, and attention turns toward the process that allowed an unexpected person to enter an area containing senior members of the royal family. According to the story, an additional name may have been approved at the local level shortly before the event. If that account is accurate, it would represent a significant failure in the normal security process. Royal engagements are carefully organized, and access to protected individuals is normally controlled through multiple layers of planning. That is why the alleged incident would have raised immediate concerns. The story also claims that Prince William became interested in the complete, unedited footage rather than simply the photographs that had already appeared publicly. That distinction matters because photographs only capture individual moments, while raw footage can reveal what happened immediately before and after an incident. It can show where people were standing, when cameras were pointed toward a particular area, and whether the confrontation appeared completely spontaneous. However, there is an important point that should not be ignored. A photographer having a good position does not automatically prove that an event was planned. Professional photographers often choose strategic positions before an event begins, especially when senior royals are expected to appear. In the same way, an unexpected guest does not automatically mean there was a conspiracy. Nevertheless, from an institutional point of view, the security question alone would be serious enough to investigate. The story suggests that officials began looking at how the invitation process worked and whether personal connections had influenced normal procedures. From there, attention allegedly expanded into questions surrounding estate management and financial reviews. This is where the story moves beyond a simple family disagreement and into the much more complicated world of institutional relationships. Royal households are built around strict procedures, formal responsibilities, and carefully defined access. When personal relationships begin crossing into those systems, even a relatively small incident can create significant consequences. That is why the alleged confrontation became more important than the few minutes it actually lasted. One of the most interesting parts of the story is the reported reaction of Princess Anne. She has long been associated with a direct, disciplined, and highly practical approach to royal duties. If the account is accurate, her response was not to turn the confrontation into a personal argument, but to focus on procedure. Instead of debating accusations about family finances, she reportedly wanted to know how the person had entered the event and who had approved her access. That approach changes the entire nature of the situation. A personal argument can easily become a media story about the people disagreeing. A security failure, however, becomes an institutional matter that has to be documented and investigated. According to the story, questions were also raised about confidential financial information and how certain details could have become known outside the people officially dealing with them. But this is where we need to separate allegations from proven facts. The mention of an audit does not prove that a particular person leaked information. A financial review does not automatically mean someone committed wrongdoing. An audit can simply identify transactions or decisions that require additional explanation. Likewise, personal or professional relationships between employees do not automatically prove corruption or misconduct. What matters is whether official procedures were followed and whether there is evidence of inappropriate behavior. The story portrays palace officials as examining administrative appointments, financial arrangements, and relationships that could potentially create conflicts of interest. If such a review really occurred, its purpose would normally be to establish fact rather than simply blame individuals. At the same time, the confrontation itself allegedly created a major problem because it brought private family disagreements into a public environment that is particularly sensitive for a royal institution where public image and internal discipline are closely connected. The most striking element, however, is the alleged silence that followed. There was no immediate public argument, no dramatic press conference, and no obvious attempt to fight the accusations in front of cameras. Instead, the people involved reportedly allowed the institutional process to take over, and sometimes, inside an organization as tightly controlled as the royal family, silence can be more significant than a public response. Eventually, the story reaches its most dramatic point. On one side are family relationships and personal loyalties. On the other side are institutional rules, financial procedures, and the reputation of the monarchy. In between is one public confrontation that reportedly brought all of these issues together at exactly the wrong moment. According to the account, the palace began reviewing security procedures, tightening access arrangements, and examining financial and administrative matters connected with the wider situation. For some observers, this might appear to be nothing more than a family dispute that became public. But from the perspective of the institution, the bigger question would be whether official events were being used to settle private disagreements. If that happened, the consequences could extend far beyond one afternoon in London. Catherine was placed in an uncomfortable position despite reportedly refusing to escalate the confrontation herself. Princess Anne allegedly responded by focusing on procedure rather than emotion. Prince William, according to the story, became focused on understanding exactly how the situation developed and whether internal systems had failed. But it is important to remember that several of the more dramatic details in this story come from an unverified account and should not be treated as established fact without reliable documentation. There is a major difference between a reported claim, an interpretation, and something officially confirmed by the royal household. So, the real question for viewers is not simply, who was right? The more interesting questions are, was this confrontation completely spontaneous? Was the security failure simply an administrative mistake? Were there already tensions inside the institution that made the situation more explosive? Or did several unrelated events simply collide at the same time? At this stage, without official evidence, there is no responsible way to give a definitive answer. What we can say is that the story demonstrates how quickly a seemingly small incident can become much larger when family, money, protocol, security, and institutional power all meet in the same room. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of the entire story. In a world where every movement can be photographed and every public reaction can become a headline, Sometimes the most powerful response is not a statement at all. Sometimes it is silence, followed by paperwork, investigation, and decisions made behind closed doors. What do you think really happened? Was this simply an emotional confrontation, or could there have been a bigger story developing behind the scenes?